When I talk about religion on this channel, there's often bigger questions lurking under the surface. What makes us human? How did new technologies reshape consciousness? What happens when ritual, community, and even grief get filtered through our screens? My guest today is Jared Henderson. He's a philosopher and author turned YouTuber whose work explores exactly those kinds of questions. He's built a channel thinking seriously about modern life in the internet age, the social media age, and the AI age, exploring topics like our attention, reading, artificial intelligence, synthetic relationships, and what all of this might be doing to us. What I like about Jared's work both on Substack and YouTube is that he doesn't just do the usual technology is bad routine. He puts our current anxieties in a much longer historical and philosophical perspective, while still taking seriously that something genuinely new and troubling might be happening right now. So in this conversation, we talk about the post-literate age, whether AI is outsourcing human cognition, why chatbot relationships feel so unsettling or even sacrilegious, and whether we can defend the life of the mind outside the crumbling walls of the university. Jared Henderson, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I'm personally delighted to meet another ex-academic turned YouTuber. From my understanding, you are a philosopher who properly got the PhD in philosophy and then decided to move into the content creator space. Just tell us a little bit about that journey.
Well, it was a bit of a long journey. So yeah, I was working on my PhD in philosophy, and I sort of looked at the academic job market and thought, oh no. Like, this isn't going to work. It's just too hard out there. And I actually originally got a job in tech. I was working for actually an AI company, which is a little bit ironic given the stuff that I talk about now. But it was a different kind of AI. It was like symbolic systems AI. It was very old school, kind of technology that, frankly, has been rendered completely irrelevant in the last couple of years. But it got me out of, I had finished my PhD and it got me a job. So that was great. But I found very quickly that I just missed having academic discussions. I think one of the hard things about being a sort of ex-academic is that you become very used to being in an intellectual community of people who are maybe not interested in the exact same things as you, but at least interested in areas related to it. And it's really hard to find that. I mean, I had actually made some philosophy friends in Austin, and that was great. But I wanted to kind of push it a little bit further. And so I just started making content. And I originally just kind of made it about whatever I wanted. I talked about books. I talked about journaling. I talked about just anything because I didn't have like a vision or a plan for the channel. But I've really narrowed down in the last year or two philosophy, but trying to find those intersections of like, how does philosophy relate to modern life? And not in the way of like writing it like Game of Thrones and philosophy, those kind of books you'd see at Barnes and Noble, but asking questions like philosophical questions about issues that already matter to people. And for a lot of that, lately, it's been philosophical questions about sort of our technological environment. Because we live on the internet, we spend hours and hours a day on the internet. And that's not even a stable place. It's changed rapidly, even since I started on YouTube a couple of years ago. And so it's just a really like fertile area to be asking kind of philosophical questions and trying to bring those resources in to like just try to make sense of everything. And that's really what I've been trying to do since I got on YouTube.
Yeah, I can definitely empathize with that. Since leaving the academy, I sometimes feel kind of isolated because you are so accustomed to having those sorts of conversations, coursework and research. And when you're outside of that environment, you kind of have your computer and the books you can read and maybe the occasional conference. But just to be out of that environment, there's just not that sort of academic community.
Yeah, I haven't even gone to a conference since I left academia. But yeah, even being in the hallway, when you're a grad student and you just like all have grad offices in hopefully the same building, and you just like run into people and you can just say, I just read this, like, let me ask you something. Or if you like have a problem, you can just like go and talk to someone immediately because it was just a community of people who had already bought in. Yeah, so it can be really isolating. But I found that like there are actually quite a lot of people that are interested in these sorts of things. Like you found this, like there are a lot of people who are interested in the academic study of religion. They might not be in academia, and it's really hard to get them concentrated in one place. That's why universities are so great, right? Because it literally just says all these scholars are going to be in 2 square miles. And so you can just go find them. The internet's much more dispersed, but that also means that you can just find lots of people who are interested in these topics who maybe themselves have also struggled to find people who are, interested in these topics.
Yeah. So your work came on my radar about a year ago, and I found myself watching so many of your videos and feeling almost a sense of anxiety. And this is not a slight to your work. It shows how powerful your work is, because it's revealing the level of dystopia we sometimes find ourselves living in. So one of your videos is on your attention span is not broken, it's being stolen from you. And I was like, oh,
yeah,
man, because as much as I use social media, it's just like it is stealing my attention.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I do think maybe especially in the last year when I've really narrowed my focus, it has become, there's a bit more of a dystopian element to the things that I discuss. But one of the things I've found as I've been thinking about these issues, like about the attention economy, or, there's all these topics like people want to know like how to get your attention span back or why you can't focus, right? And usually that's put in terms of like productivity. That's how everyone wants to address it. It turns out though, as I started thinking about this and I was reading more, these same problems have arisen again and again throughout history. So with the advent of the printing press, scholars were suddenly worried that there were too many books to read. All right, that's already like a problem about the information economy sort of being flooded. And they had to figure out what to do about it. And, Petrarch writes a book about the life of solitude. And we don't think about sort of Petrarch's time as that busy compared to ours, but it was already something that he was worried about enough that he wanted to dedicate an entire book sort of advocating the life of solitude. And so I found that there's actually a sense of solace there because you can look to the past and see that people have struggled with these problems for so long, and they've always found solutions. And yes, a lot of our current media environment, our sort of technological environment, is quite dystopian. I think we live basically in like a hostile design environment where everyone is trying to grab your attention. If you want to even put a positive message out into the world or informational content, you still have to think about how to break through that sort of noise barrier. It's part of the craft of like being on YouTube, for instance. And so we do live in a time where these problems probably have reached a new scale that they've never reached before, but they're not problems that are necessarily new in kind. That was like part of the point of that video about your attention span being stolen, is that actually the techniques that are used to steal your attention span now were already being used in the 19th century with the rise of the newspaper industry. And I take that to be rather comforting, because it means some people figured out how to handle newspapers, and some people figured out how to like not let themselves doom scroll or the equivalent doom flip on newspapers. Lots of people didn't, but some people did, and that means we can probably figure out these problems too.
Yeah, let's dwell on reading for an example, because you also have videos on how to be a better reader, how to keep your attention on a book for more than 10-15 seconds. I appreciate you bringing up the long span of history, because I think about that often myself. I'm a scholar of religion first, but an ancient historian second, and I frequently look to history. Like, humanity has survived so many things. And when we think about, I've heard this term all the time, the post-literate society. Nobody's reading anymore. It's all video. But when you think about human history, like mass literacy is a blip in human history, just the last 100 years or so. Literacy was the purview of like the 1% of the 1% for as the past 5,000 years that writing has existed. And then for the 150,000 years of Homo sapiens, like nobody was reading. So surely post-literacy shouldn't matter that much, should it?
Well, I do think it matters quite a bit, but I do think looking at the history is useful. Yeah, first, it's really helpful to remember that for the vast majority of human history, there was no literacy. There was no reading, there was no writing. Yeah, in the vast majority of human history, there was no reading, there was no writing. We lived in oral societies. Walter Ong is good on this. He has a book called From Orality to Literacy that's very useful kind of as a historical survey. And Ong's main point in that book, though, is that the introduction of literacy is transformative of human consciousness. In particular, it facilitates memory in a new way. You no longer have to memorize everything. And when you have to memorize everything, you have to structure your thoughts in such a way that they are memorable. So this is why, epics or epic poems were the sort of thing that could get passed down, because they're much more memorable. And some of the earliest examples of writing that we have are things like record keeping, which is just numbers, basically proto-accounting, because those are kind of always never going to be very memorable for all the details. Writing allowed us to do this. And then writing allowed us to engage in a new type of reflection where you could actually revisit your own thoughts, basically exactly as they were in the past. You know, one of the things about recollection is we're always changing our memories as we revisit them. And so it's very actually hard for us to remember things exactly. Obviously, we see this with the transmission of like oral text or, you know, oral traditions. Things are always being slightly altered and changed. But even as you recollect on what it's like to be a child, well, in 5 years, when you recollect on that same event, you're going to remember it slightly differently because who you are is different. But if you were to say, keep a journal from a young age, you can actually see your thoughts exactly as you wanted to express them at an earlier age. And that's kind of one of the transformative effects of writing. But now we have this it's over what people call the post-literate age. James Marriott is one of these people. I did a podcast with him about this. And it's very easy to engage in to become a Cassandra here, to talk about how this is going to be the downfall of civilization, that liberal democracy is going to crumble, or whatever institution you love is never going to last. You know, I'm worried about, the future of universities in a world where people don't want to read very much. And I do think that there are real risks. And what I see, though, as a critic of this, as someone who's trying to critically analyze it, is to not talk about it as if it's a reversion to orality, but to ask what comes next. So if writing was so transformative of human consciousness, what does the move to video and audio and sort of broadcast, what would that actually do to human consciousness? And we see this a bit with how radio affected us and how TV affected us. And so it's all part of this continuation of this technological progress. Now, I don't want to imply that, therefore, it'll be just as good as the literate age. But I don't want to also say that there are no goods that might be opened up or no new interesting changes. And I think that's kind of the point of trying to approach it in a scholarly fashion, is to admit the nuance and the ambiguity and the uncertainty we have as we enter into the post-literate age, if that's actually where we're heading.
I've never heard it framed like that we will not revert to orality. If orality means sitting around the fire, telling a story about the Iliad or the Odyssey, we're not going to revert to that, because so much of media is mediated through screens now. So it might have been you, or I was listening to another podcast that uses the phrase the broadcast society. So if we're post-literate, what are we going toward? We're going toward a broadcast society where more and more people are posting content on Instagram, TikTok, and that's how you receive your information. And that introduces so many different issues, like the performativity of media, of social media. Everybody talks about, be authentic, but the very performance of authenticity is itself as a performance. So you lose the sense of orality, where it was also a collective experience.
Yeah, in an oral society, it's me talking to you, face to face, or maybe at a slight distance if I'm particularly loud. In a broadcast society, it's not only how people receive information, but broadcast is how people are going to record information, or at least that's what I currently think. When people have thoughts, they open their phone and they make a TikTok video, and they're like, this is my thoughts about Israel and Palestine. This is my thoughts about whatever pressing issue we have today. This is how we transmit recipes, right? There's something really interesting about how recipes and food traditions, maybe we're going to simplify here, but at first it goes being passed down from parent to child, mother to daughter. And then it becomes, cookbooks become the way that recipes are passed down. And in fact, eventually the way that even your grandmother gives you her recipes is by writing them down. And that's a change in how we transmit information. Now, for a lot of people, how they learn to cook is by watching 60 or 90-second TikToks that give them recipes. The question is what changes when you do that, right? And I think that when we move to writing, for instance, recipes slowly became more precise. If you look at very early recipes, they're often written with just enough salt, or we had all of these very human-based measurements, a pinch a dab. And then we got more and more precise because we knew we would be broadcasting to larger audiences. And then with actual broadcasts, though, I think one of the interesting things about this is how quickly like recipes evolve. So new like trends emerge, and then people find new ways to incorporate those trends into lots of different dishes. You know, you can read about the fact that like miso paste is like one of the big ingredients of like the last couple of years. Okay, this is a very traditional food stuff from a very particular part of the world that is now people talking about it, like how to use it in your macaroni and cheese. Okay, like and it happens so fast. And I think that leads to some instability and maybe some lack of a sense of belonging to like a particular culture or a particular place. But it also leads to a lot of creativity, right? So there are these pros and cons here. And as you think about just like the transmission of ideas, right? Like, or like political ideologies as like another example, you know, growing up in kind of like the rise of the internet age, but it was still very much like the dial-up, early Wikipedia kind of days, you could learn a lot about political ideologies that went beyond maybe being a Republican and a Democrat, which is basically all I knew growing up in like rural Ohio. Now, though, you'll find people who make these incredibly fine-grained taxonomies of all the possible political positions you could hold. And that can be helpful, but also it means that for a lot of them, like political discussions are just about placing things in those taxonomies. And so like the very existence of the creation of like, or the creation of those taxonomies also changed what people thought like the point of politics was. And I think that's part of this larger point that like how information is transmitted and how information is stored and how it's structured actually structures how we think about problems. So we might think about problems in a way that's easily facilitated by those structures. And the question is like, are those the right ways to think about those problems? Are there other ways that we're missing? What, you know, for every way of thinking that is incentivized by a structure, there's at least one other way of thinking that is disincentivized by that structure. And you can even see this in how people write about, let's say, religion in an academic context, where the point is to give lots of historical detail, where it's to ground it in a wider body of theory, where it's to really contextualize the problem and usually to make a fairly small point and to make incremental progress, versus how someone might write like a Substack article, which is designed to go to a much wider audience. There's usually less contextualizing work, and there is a bit more of a performance. I don't want to say that academia is totally free of that performativity, but you're performing for a very particular community there that has very precise norms that maybe aren't codified, but most people could kind of tell you what the norms are. In fact, this is part of the process of like, I'm sure you heard this in graduate school, professionalization. Like, and you learned how to professionalize, and part of that is like learning the norms of the scholarly community. Well, we just don't have that robust set of norms when we're writing for a much larger audience, and that means it's a bit more of a free-for-all. And what the rules are is also up for debate. And what changes there? I mean, that's another big question to ask. Another way of thinking about that is just that we have gotten used to thinking that, well, let's go back to orality for a second. In an oral culture, you kind of always know the exact context of your audience. You usually share the exact context of your audience. In a literate society, suddenly your words can be stripped of that context and read by anyone across the world, but they move very slowly, and books often come with like a provenance, right? Like they'll tell you where they're from and you can figure it out a little bit. An article or like a tweet that suddenly gets sent out to a much larger audience than was intended, there's almost no way to track that context. And so how do you transmit information when you can't take all of that context for granted, which is actually a huge part of human communication, is relying on background assumptions and norms and common knowledge? What do you do when you can't rely on that anymore? And I think it's just fair to say that will radically transform how we communicate. I think we're already seeing it, and we'll probably just see a lot more of it going forward.
This reminds me a lot of the work of the anthropologist Roy Rappaport. He wrote a lot about religious ritual and how ritual acts as an information processing system generation after generation. So he actually used the analogy of a computer. So computers have ones and zeros. So a lot of rituals are 1 or 0. Are you married or are you not married? Well, the marriage ceremony, the ritual, provides information to society to tell, okay, this person is now married. The same with the presidential inauguration. It's literally a collective ritual that is turning this person from president-elect to president. And coming of age ceremonies are the same. This person is an adolescent, now they're adult. Seasonal festivals, usually it's taking something from nature. So, the changing from spring to summer is ambiguous. That's ambiguous data that you can't do much with. But the seasonal festival, that's like, we are now starting summer, that has provided information, maybe not on a meteorological scale that summer has started, but on a societal scale, okay, summer has now started. So when I think about ritual as an information processing system that's giving information to the next generation, that also seems to be something that is lost in a broadcast society where you mentioned how in an oral society, you know your context, you know the context of your audience, and much of those contexts are ritualized. And now in a broadcast society, not only is it decollectivized or decontextualized, there's no ritual providing information to society.
Yeah, but I think we'll eventually try to invent those. And I think you kind of see this. This is, a hot button topic to address, but look at the way that people have handled, say, like the killing of Charlie Kirk, right? There are like ritualized mourning that happens, but it happens not just in like the big memorial service they had for him, but also the way that people create AI avatars of him to like send messages and things. We don't actually create AI avatars of people who are alive yet. I mean, people do it like on Sora, but they usually do it for comedic purposes. But in a weird way, when someone's died and they're like publicly salient, they've started to create AI avatars in a way that like can transmit wisdom. Here's how to carry on my legacy or whatever, right? And it doesn't have to be Charlie Kirk. That he's just like the example I keep seeing online right now.
Confucius recently, they've created an AI Confucius. So the Kong family, which is the Confucius family, has created a AI Confucius that you can interact with.
Yeah, so we want to like, it's a way of trying to make like the dead much more like immediate to us. I mean, I see it as partly like we're totally fooling ourselves because of like what AI is, but I think it's maybe it's helpful for me to try to place that in more of like a understanding of ritual. This isn't people actually literally thinking they're interacting with Confucius. I mean, some people might, but like it might be like a kind of ritualized thing. It could be a kind of ritualized activity that's part of like the mourning process, or that's part of religious devotion, or that's part of collective decision making. Like who knows where it could go, but I think it will go in weirder and weirder directions, at least for a little while.
Well, I think that's a good segue into AI, because a lot of your content focuses on artificial intelligence, and we can attack it from several angles here. I still feel anxiety about social media stealing our attention, but my fear of social media has taken a back seat to my fear of these large language models, because if social media is stealing my attention, ChatGPT steals my cognition. There's a lot of conversation around de-skilling, where somebody who used to be very proficient at writing or coding or writing lyrics for music, they outsource it to ChatGPT, and over the course of months and years, they de-skill. They lose that skill. And you also see this in corporate settings, where you have the senior people in a corporation who have spent 30 years of their life perfecting these skills. The entry-level people coming out of college, they've been using ChatGPT from the jump, and therefore have not created those skills. So that you almost get this population gap in skill sets. So I guess what I'm saying is, are you as afraid as I am about outsourcing our cognition to ChatGPT?
Oh yeah, I am. This is a real source of anxiety for me. I think that for a lot of people, we all never really believed that like reading a book summary was the same as reading a book. We kind of believed that it was good enough for passing a test or writing a paper for a college class you didn't care about. But it seems like with the rise of AI, where I don't know why, but AI, like everyone takes it as authoritative. They're like, if the AI said it, it just is true. Even though we all know about the problems of hallucinations, we know how especially as context gets larger and larger in these models. They get weirder and weirder. Like, we all know the problems. And yet when it says it, like the way people use Grok on Twitter, what is now X, it's just like, Grok, is this true? As if, like, we used to think that we needed human fact checkers who had their own problems, but at least it was like an attempt by humans to fact check the information landscape. And now we think, well, we'll just have an AI fact checker, and it gets it humorously wrong or comically wrong or actually just tragically wrong. I don't know, 50% of the time, or some important amount that would make you think, like, this isn't that reliable. But for some reason, people take it as authoritative. I don't know if it's like the method of presentation or just the fact that it kind of feels like an oracle. Like, it kind of feels like visiting the Oracle of Delphi or something and asking it a big question. It just like gives you the answer. Or the fact that sometimes they're trained to be more sycophantic, and so they just tell you what you want to hear, and people love to agree with what they already want to hear. But for whatever reason, we're like, wow, we can just trust this thing. And people use it to summarize stuff instead of reading it, which is, I think, a huge problem, because in reading, you're not just gaining information, but you're actually thinking with the author and trying to think critically and follow the argument and to understand if it actually works. I mean, this is a huge part of like the act of reading. Reading is not just about extracting information. And it's really apparent when people are using it for their writing, because what does writing do for you as a human being? It allows you to structure and to codify your thoughts and to try to regiment them in a way that is rational, that is compelling, that has a kind of logical ordering to it, and that communicates well. These are all skills you need, not just in the act of writing, but actually in the act of like living as a good human being. And if you're not practicing that with writing or with other sorts of activities that are similar, then the question is, like, where do you ever develop those skills in the first place? You know, one of my big philosophical influences is Aristotle. And one of the things that Aristotle will say is, like, the virtues are not in us by nature. The virtues are things that you cultivate, and you cultivate them through trial and error and through education. And if we basically use AI to do all of our writing for us and do all of our thinking for us, we're never going to cultivate those, specifically those intellectual virtues. And I just don't see how to reach people about this yet, because there are people who are worried about it, and there are people who are enthusiastic about it. And I've never been able to bridge the gap and find people who are enthusiastic about it and like get them to be worried. And I've also never seen someone who's worried become more enthusiastic. I've been told by people like, oh, don't you understand? AI is actually going to be like a really great tutor. And it could be like a private tutor for you to help you learn a new language or like learn a new skill. And I'm like open to the theoretical possibility that it could do that. Let's just like admit the possibility for a moment. But the question is, how do people actually use it? Like, how does it actually get used in practice? And very few people are using it as tutors, it seems. And lots of people are using it to do their work for them and to do their intellectual work for them, or I would just say to do their thinking for them. And it's that rise of like a thoughtless world that has me particularly concerned. I think once you enter into a world of thoughtlessness, it's a much less interesting world. It's a much less beautiful world. It's also a world where people will believe anything. And worlds where people will believe anything are typically dangerous and unstable worlds. And I think all of that is related somehow to this cognitive offloading that we see in AI.
I used to teach university writing. It was like the main class I taught back in graduate school. And there was so much hype about, oh, the college essay is dead because ChatGPT can write the college essay. And I think any grad student or professor would tell you, well, the point is not the college essay. I have now read hundreds of college essays, and they're usually not amazing works of prose. The whole point, like you said, is to organize your thoughts and to do the work of research, going to the library and digesting the book and then trying to put the argument of the book into your own words. And all of that takes heavy cognitive work. It's not easy. And sometimes the end product is quite messy, and that's just not the point. It was the process. And like you said, people are not using it as a tutor. They push the button and sometimes walk away from the computer and have the product. You had one video recently about the professors are cheating now too, though. Like, you have the students write their papers with ChatGPT, and then the professors grade the papers with ChatGPT. And you just get this unvirtuous cycle of just AI slop that's not benefiting anyone.
And I would say it's actively harming a lot of people, because why would a student want to pay $25,000 or a year or more to then be graded by an AI for the work that they produced with an AI? But also, university administrators, they're not my favorite people in the world, but they're also not total morons. And so they'll eventually think, well, if every professor in the world is just using ChatGPT to grade these papers, why do we need so many professors? And so you're actually like in the act of offloading. The students are making education less worthwhile for themselves. And eventually the rational ones will say, why am I paying so much for this when I'm not getting anything from it aside from the degree itself, like the credential. And then the professors who are doing this, I would say, are probably offloading their way out of a job. And so not only does it kind of make a mockery of education, but it also just leads to, I think, a totally unstable educational environment where these institutions we've relied on, like having places like universities, which could be these bastions of knowledge, which also educate people. There's sort of a weird thing with universities. They do two things at once. They provide education, and that's kind of like their main purpose, right? Maybe. But there's a secondary purpose, which is also critical, which is the production of knowledge and the transmission of knowledge, but also like the preservation of knowledge. It's why every time you lose a Renaissance historian at a university, you want to hire another Renaissance historian because you don't want to like lose this knowledge. And this model it's not the way universities have always been structured, the kind of production, the union of research and teaching. It's very much like a 19th century German model, but it's worked really well since it became the dominant model of universities. And if we don't know what to do about the education bit because of AI, then there's this question of like, what happens to the research and preservation of knowledge bit? And there aren't competing institutions that can pick up the slack on that part. And so as like it harms the educational aspect too, just what happens to, niche languages that are only studied by a few scholars? The University of Chicago basically just liquidated a huge amount of its language departments. I don't know if you follow any of this news, but the University of Chicago, one of the reasons it's notable is because it has all these niche languages. They might only have 3 students a year who want to take Sanskrit or some other language, but they had enough experts that they could teach it. And it was really important, even though it doesn't make a lot of economic sense year over year, it's really important that like one institution or 2 institutions have those experts, because we did a lot of work to recover a lot of these languages. We've lost many of them before. We did a lot of work to recover them. I don't want to have to do all that work again to recover them in the future. And the university right now is the place where that is preserved. And I just don't know what happens to any of that in the sort of the AI university as it's like seems to be emerging.
Yeah. Yeah, this happened. I mean, religious studies is usually first on the chopping block for the amount of department closures that has happened in the last 2 or 3 years is staggering. And then UNC just recently closed a bunch of their institutes where they housed language learning as well. Like they had a Yucatan Maya language section, which is incredibly important if you're studying Mesoamerica, and just liquidated. And I mean, perhaps we can talk a bit about our vocation as YouTubers. I sometimes feel like I'm fighting like a vanguard defense of religious studies outside of the academy while the academy crumbles. Like, I don't want Religion for Breakfast to be a replacement to a university degree program, because I just simply can't deliver that with 15 to 20 minute long explainer videos, So you've mentioned this too on your YouTube channel, the irony of, worrying about the post-literate society while feeding into the broadcast society. Is this something that you've grappled with?
Yeah. So for one thing, yeah, I occasionally make longer philosophy explainers too, in addition to some of the work I do. And I know that most people who watch those videos don't go and read Plato for themselves, but I'm trying to reach some people to like go and read Plato for themselves. I also know that a 90-minute video about Plato from me is not a replacement for a seminar on Plato. What I tell myself and I think it's true, is that for a lot of people, going back to those seminars on Plato just isn't an option. And so part of what I'm doing is like a public service that luckily helps me like sustain my life, but a public service to like get that knowledge out, maybe in a lower resolution than you would get in a seminar, but to get it out into the world to let people engage with it for themselves. And I'm really struck by the fact that a lot of people reach out to me and say, I watched your videos and I read more now. And I've even had some people say, like, I used to watch your videos and then I just stopped watching YouTube because I want to read more. And there's a bit of professional concern where I'm like, well, if I'm really successful, YouTube dies. And of course, I'll never have that big of an impact. But I'm actually really heartened by that. Like, I think it means that for some people, it does make a difference. And I'm sure that there have been people who have watched your videos who maybe they didn't go and get degrees in religious studies, but started to actually like read those texts for themselves, or to read popular histories of religion, maybe even some scholarly work on religion. And one of the things I'm impressed by that you do is that you run these classes too. That you have like a nonprofit, right? Like a sort of institute that's sort of this larger thing to bring education. It's still online. It's still through these like Zoom calls or however it is that you structure it. But you're giving people an opportunity to go deeper in a way that's not like your standard YouTuber course, you know, buy these 7 videos for $49.99 or whatever, but also would let them then kind of engage in something like scholarly activity, or at least just the life of the mind. I care more about them leading the life of the mind than them becoming scholars. Because a scholar is typically someone who's employed by a university or employed by like a research institute. There are independent scholars, but I care much more about just encouraging people to engage with ideas on their own. And that's what I mean when I say to engage in the life of the mind. And to get people to do that, though, you have to go where the people are. I think of it a little bit like Jonah has to go to Nineveh, even though he really doesn't like Nineveh. And he might complain a lot about it. But you have to go where people are. And you have to be willing to engage in the media that they're already consuming in order to reach them. I mean, that's just the truth. I can write things. I write like a newsletter. It does well, but it doesn't reach nearly as many people as a YouTube video. And if I really believed everything I was saying, maybe I would actually feel compelled to go make a TikTok account just because it's where lots of viewers are. If you're not willing to go to where people are, then there's just going to be a lot of people that get left behind. And that's what I think sort of educational YouTubers can do, is to say that there are people who are online who want more. They want more out of their online experience, and they're not going to log off yet. And they wouldn't even know what to do if they logged off yet. And so they're going to go online, and we can meet them where they are, and then maybe offer them a kind of on-ramp to living slightly differently. And by that, I mean a life where these ancient texts are not actually that intimidating. You could go and actually just start reading them. A life where ideas are something for you to critically assess for yourself, not for you to just have summarized for you. And I think that's what we can do quite well. You know, there's a video I love from your channel recently where you talked about like why religions and media feel fake. And I loved that I loved that video because I thought it was like a great trick. And I don't know if this is how you thought about it, but it was like, it looks like it's going to be a video about Game of Thrones, kind of from the very beginning. And it kind of is, but really it's about the sociology of religion. and really it's about what are these sociological features that emerge in religion as it is actually lived out in the world. And I was like, wow, that's such a cool way to do it. And when I watched the video, I was like, of course, like the emphasis on syncretism, that no one kind of lives in a non-syncretic religion, right? Like they were always drawing from the different kinds of traditions that are part of our larger culture or our history. It was like, cool. Like, and so I thought that video was really informative, but it met people where they were because they might have wondered to themselves, like, you know, I like Game of Thrones, but like, why did the Sept feel unconvincing? Why did it feel like a shallow part of the show? Why did the old gods maybe feel a little bit more real and still a bit of a parody, right? And I thought that was such a good way to do it. So I guess this is just part of the video where I compliment you a lot. But I thought it was such a good way to do it because it was doing exactly what I was saying. It met people where they were. They're already interested in that media. But then it said, hey, actually, if you really want to understand it, you need to understand some sociologists of religion, people nobody reads, right? Right? Like, at least comparatively. And you were able to introduce them to something that was really worthwhile.
The funny thing about religious studies is so much of it is trickery, where the student signs up for intro to religion and they expect they're going to learn about Hinduism, then Buddhism, then Christianity, and instead it's all theory and method. Like, what do you mean by religion? What do you mean by ritual? What do you mean by the sacred? So that's classic religious studies pedagogy of tricking you into a sociology of religion class.
Religious studies might be the most interesting field along one dimension, and it's like the only field I know of where a lot of scholars don't seem to think it's a well-defined phenomenon in the first place. And I always find that so funny. Like, most philosophers would say, like, I don't know how to precisely define philosophy, but I kind of know it when I see it. And religious studies scholars are like, religion, who knows? Are Labubu's religion? And they mean it. And I always find that kind of charming.
Yeah, I come from the school of thought of Jonathan Z. Smith, who is a scholar of religion, big time back in the 80s, and he basically said religion is the invention of the scholar. Like, we define what it is and put into that bucket what we call religion, which it's a little bit mind bending, but it is a field without a signifier.
But yet it's been informative and helpful too. It also, there is good work being done even with that, and that's kind of an interesting tension to live with.
Yeah, another video I'm working on, this will be a teaser for the audience, but I'm coming up with a video titled 5 Bad Definitions of Religion. And the trick is, like, all definitions of religion are bad, but some are worse than others. And we'll go through and start with the really bad ones and go to, like, possibly more accurate definitions.
That's good. And then, yeah, you're not going to give them the resolution they thought they were going to get, but that's okay. That's part of learning, is understanding that resolution doesn't always come easily.
So much of your work is it's animated by a concern for how people should live. And I see this coming up a lot with AI synthetic relationships. You had a recent video about a company that basically wants to take your deceased relatives and turn them into chatbots, so you can still chat with grandma even after she died. I'm horrified by this in kind of this visceral human sense. It just feels so deeply wrong in, like, a sacred versus profane sense. I would love to think about this more from a religious studies angle, like just this deep sacrilege of reanimating grandma with an AI chatbot. Let's dig down on synthetic relationships, and why does it feel like sacrilege?
Well, for one, I think the emphasis that you had earlier on ritual is probably helpful here, because we have had throughout history lots of rituals for handling the dead. We have prolonged mourning processes that are usually quite regimented, even in cultures that don't have as strict of processes. We kind of understand, like, between, like, the death and the funeral, there's, like, this particularly intense period of mourning. The funeral is kind of this marker of, like, when this person really has left human society. Like, the body is no longer there. You kind of can't say anything to them anymore. Lots of people want to go and say their final words to a coffin, or to the corpse, to the body in the coffin. That's really useful. Oh, and then we have different ways of, visiting them on the anniversary of their death, or tomb sweeping rituals as a way of, like, showing honor to the dead. We've codified all of these ways to figure out what our relationship to the dead is going to be. And what these new technologies do is say, I mean, the way I kind of read it is, they say, you don't actually have to worry about all of that, because grandma never left. And you always have grandma with you, even if she died. And all you need to do is create this AI clone of her. And, in the ad that I was critiquing at part of it, it shows a young boy who actually never met his grandmother. She was dead before he was born. And it shows him growing up. And then he is showing her AI avatar that he and his partner are having a baby. So he's reached adulthood and has now entered into this huge part of his new life. And she gets to be, like, a part of that. This strikes me as so odd because, for one, your grandmother actually doesn't get to see this. It is an avatar, right? It is a representation of your grandmother. And the other part was that it didn't seem to have an idea about grief anywhere. Like there was no sense of grief or mourning. It was just like, don't worry, they're always with you. And that's something a lot of like religious people will say, like the dead are always with us. And that's like, let's assume that for a second, like what they mean by it. But that's like true in one sense and false in another, right? Right? Like maybe their spirit can like, you can communicate with it somehow, but it like in a literal sense, like they're not in the room with you. And you have to learn how to live with that. I had written an article about this on my Substack originally before I made a video about it. And one of the things I mentioned was like my grandfather, who was really important in my early life. And he died when I was in college. And it's the death I've had like the most trouble coming to terms with of all the people that I've known. And when I had a son, when my son was born, I started to wonder like, how could he possibly grow up to be like a good person if my grandfather wasn't there to like teach him those lessons that like I learned from my grandfather? And what I wrote was that one of the things that was part of me, I think actually coming to terms with my grandfather's death was me realizing that I had to fill in that role for my son as a way of like honoring my grandfather. And it actually made it easier for me to like think about my grandfather being dead. And he's been dead for almost a decade now, but it's been a death that really stuck with me. But if it were just an option of like, oh, actually my AI avatar of my grandfather can like give him advice whenever he needs it, I actually would have never come to that personal realization too. And so that was actually an opportunity for growth for me. And I think will make my son better off because I'll be prepared, or at least prepared to attempt to like sort of play that role with him. And if I had been able to basically offload it, like we were talking about before, to the AI avatar, I would have been robbing both my son and myself of this opportunity. Now that's putting it all in very personal terms, but I also have like a very strong sense that this is profane, that in some way like the dead are sacred in some way. And I can't rationally explain this. This is a weird part of human life, but I can point to the fact that everyone in history, it seems, or huge amounts of people in history have seemed to agree that the dead are accorded a certain kind of honor and respect, and our relationship to them changes when they die. And what I thought was happening with these AI avatars of dead people is that it's like our relationship to them hasn't changed at all. I guess in a way, like, why do I find the AI avatar so profane? It's because we're no longer treating the dead as sacred. In fact, we get to kind of ignore the actual departed and then content ourselves with the AI avatars. And that seems to me to be like a particularly troubling possibility.
I think so much of my horror is tied to the sheer lack of personhood. Like this chatbot is not the person. There's this ontological lack, and by treating it as the person, the deceased person, there's just something profoundly wrong there. And this is coming from someone. I'm a huge science fiction fan. I see Lieutenant Commander Data on Star Trek, and he is a person that should have rights. There's a very excellent episode in the early seasons where there's a literal court case determining if Lieutenant Commander Data is a person. I will be the first in line to give artificial intelligence rights because of the science fiction that I've read. But
is that the measure of the man, I think is
exactly.
the title or
that's
something?
the name of the title, exactly. And I just don't see...
It's a great episode.
Great episode. If anybody who has not, go watch Star Trek right now. But I just don't see that personhood yet. I would need to see that argument made. And then we would need to have an argument about should we create if indeed these artificial intelligences achieve personhood, should we create a clone of somebody who has passed and then afford personhood to that new clone? Like these are questions that we probably will be asking in the next 20 years. Currently, though, treating the chatbot, creating a synthetic relationship with this is just not the person. Well, why are you treating it like the person? Because it's not the person.
I mean, let's grant for a moment, right, that in some hypothetical future, we have fully sentient AI like Data, okay? And we would say that's total, and we want to give them rights, and we want to give them respect in a way that they are just silicon-based life forms where we're carbon-based life forms. Let's grant that possibility. But then you said, okay, now when my grandfather dies, I'm going to make a silicon-based life form that's a perfect imitation of him. And that silicon-based life form will be a person, right? And then I'll just treat it like my grandfather. And I think we still have the strong sense that like that's wrong. And I think it would be wrong in the same way that like if your wife died, you then went and found like a woman who looked identical to your wife and got her to like pretend to be your wife, right? As a way to like, and maybe you could teach her all like everything that she would do around the house, and it would be, there's something wrong about that. So even though it's not wrong after a spouse has died, after a period of mourning, to like go and remarry, that's totally acceptable. And what seems unhealthy about that is that you are trying to replace the original person with a facsimile of that person. And it kind of doesn't matter if you're replacing them with what is ultimately a person or not a person. I think it's the replacement that actually bothers us. Philosophers who write about the philosophy of love put it as that love is a de re attitude. So you have it towards a particular object rather than a de dicto attitude where you have it towards any object that meets a certain description. So if your wife suddenly was cloned, right, you would still like love your original wife because you have love de re toward her, even though the clone would be identical. I think that's right. And so if I want to show respect to my grandfather, I show it to him in some fashion. I don't show that respect by finding a copy of him and then showing that respect to that copy.
I think bringing up love is a good example too, because so many of these synthetic relationships are with these girlfriend and boyfriend chatbots, and people, it's almost like a level of psychosis where people get enraptured with these chatbots, where they feel like they are building a relationship with them. And I think Sam Altman just recently announced that they'll be releasing a adult version of ChatGPT in 2026, where it will supercharge these chatbot love interests to become sexual phone partners, almost like we're putting the phone sex operators out of a job.
It's like they watched Her, the Joaquin Phoenix film, and then didn't get to the ending, where like the point is, the resolution of that film is that he no longer has the AI girlfriend because she left with all the other AI, and then he finally has to write a letter to his ex-wife, like explaining his feelings and kind of forgiving her and forgiving himself at the same time. He had to do that. And the AI girlfriend was in fact getting in the way of the personal growth that didn't allow him to speak to his wife, Catherine. It ended up being a really prescient movie for that reason. But yeah, there's early academic research about this. Unfortunately, a lot of it is almost like basic ethnography in the sense of like finding populations that are affected and describing. And that's useful research. But as you know, eventually we want more of that. And then we want like longer studies, and we want to, be able to assess it. But that early research of just rigorously describing what it's like for some people is going to be helpful. And the stuff that I've read indicates that people don't just fall in love with these, they form incredibly strong bonds. So much so that people will say that they've never had a relationship like it, that they've never had a relationship with a human being that was like their relationship with the AI that they've found on their phone. That is immediately a worrying possibility, in part because we already live in a very like alienated time and a very lonely time. And, the question that we need to answer kind of societally is someone who spends all of their time with their AI girlfriend more lonely because they're doing this? Or are they less lonely because they actually have a sense of connection? Like loneliness really is, it's a desire for social connection and an unmet need. You kind of need both. You need the desire and and then the fact that the desire is not fulfilled. And if they are fulfilling that desire, even if they're kind of fooling themselves, maybe for individuals there could be some psychological benefits. I have to admit the possibility. But overall, is it going to make people more likely to form connections, more likely to form communities? And I think if you look at the history of technology over the last maybe 50 or 60 years, the answer has always been no. In Robert Putnam's Bowling Alone, which is about loneliness in America, the first chapter where he admits that he can find strong evidence for what contributed to loneliness is television. It's the television chapter. It's not women entering the workforce, as that was like one of the things that he thought it would be. He's like, actually, the evidence is really bad, right? But it's television. And why? Because suddenly, what do you do at 6 p.m. after you eat dinner? You sit down at the TV. And it got rid of all of these little communal experiences, just like sitting on your porch or going for walks. When you go for walks, you run into your neighbors, right? Radio had already done that somewhat, but radio just wasn't as engaging. TV seemed to have like the really strong impact. The internet did that clearly, that there would be people who, I feel like when we were growing up, the big thing was like people who got really addicted to MMOs. And, they had friends on their MMOs, but they had no other social life. And they would spend 6 hours a night playing. And we would look at that and say, well, I'm glad you have friends there. But what if like occasionally you also went outside and like saw people in your community? And then we see with like smartphones, just the rise of sitting in rooms of people and scrolling, right? So already it just seems like there's this long trend. As technology has progressed over the last 50 years or so, it has led us to become more alienated and less social. And will AI be any different? And I think the early indications are no, that it won't, unless you can make that really strong argument that actually these AI relationships are just as good for you as the human relationships. And I don't think we're there yet.
Yeah, something tells me that will not prove to be true. I sometimes feel a little embarrassed that I'm kind of a Luddite. All throughout my 20s, I was kind of the excited about technology kind of guy. Like, I'm somewhat embarrassed to admit I was watching like Elon Musk's SpaceX videos of the rocket landing itself and watching the iPhone announcements every single year. Like, I was very much plugged into the tech excitement of the 2010s. And here I find myself wondering, like, should I form like a Amish style retreat center or something, like, or found a school. Like, I've never wanted to be a school headmaster, but like maybe we need an elementary and middle school where it's like no screens at all. Like, it's just styluses and cuneiform tablets. And a part of me feels like, what, because there's Luddites of every generation. Am I just going to be the Luddite of the 2020s, the Andrew Henry who retreated away from tech? And I don't know. I feel it deep in my bones, though, that these are troubling times.
I think it's really easy for us to gloss over something you said there. Was like the 2010s were incredibly techno optimistic, and that was definitely part of the air that you and I were breathing at the time. And it was really easy to just be enthusiastic because there were new and exciting changes, it seemed like, coming out every year, right? And so we all embraced it really quickly. And part of it is, I mean, to put it kind of simply, a lot of it just seemed really cool. And we thought, that's cool, let's give it a shot. And then we embraced it so enthusiastically that we never asked ourselves like the critical questions of, should we do this? What does it take from us too? Every piece of technology gives us something and takes something in return. The calculator allows you to do massively complex mathematics very quickly. It basically destroys your ability to do arithmetic in your head, unless you kind of actively fight against it. Literacy basically destroyed memory. This goes all the way back to Plato. Plato was worried that the advent of writing, or the sort of spread of writing, would destroy memory and wisdom. And we never asked those questions about those technologies, or at least it wasn't the dominant conversation, because everything just seemed so cool at the time. And one of the positives of the 2020s is that I just think like techno optimism is kind of untenable. We've started to see the downsides much more than we've are still feeling the upsides. And as we feel the downsides more, this puts us in a position to start actually critically assessing the decisions that we're going to make in the future, but also the decisions we made maybe in the last 10 or 20. And once you start, analyzing 10 or 20 years ago, you start asking bigger questions like, how much technology do I actually need in my life? And it doesn't have to be all or nothing. We use the internet because we're on YouTube. Cool. Does this mean you should be on your phone constantly? No. And it seems to me like there are lots of nuanced possibilities that we could embrace in the future. I personally kind of share your urge to start a school for kids that's basically pencils and paper, that I'm not going back to tablets and cuneiform tablets, but I understand the romance of it. My son, for instance, does all of his learning with books. He's still kind of young. We give him small amounts of screen time, but it's highly regulated. But we read to him constantly, and I think that's kind of critical. And when he's learning to write or like working on basic phonics as he gets a little bit older, it'll be on pieces of paper with books with us instead of like an app, because I think that will be better for him. I know that he is going to grow up in a world that is flooded by technology. And those technologies, by the time he is an adult, might be things that I currently cannot comprehend. I'm totally open to that possibility. But what I can do is prepare him for that world by not making him so dependent on those technologies from the very beginning. And yeah, you said Luddite, right? You said you're worried that you're just going to be one of those Luddites. I think the Luddites are often really misunderstood. We use it as this pejorative, right? The original Luddites were basically workers who were worried about automation and industrialization as robbing them of like wages and the dignity of work. They were right to be concerned. And then Luddites throughout history, I think they've been the ones who have maybe sometimes almost exclusively been able to see the downsides, but sometimes you need some people in the culture who can only see the downsides to remind you that they even exist. You need the pessimist in an optimistic age. And maybe one day we'll get so technologically pessimistic that we're going to need those countercultural optimists again to remind us. I like to remind myself regularly that modern medicine has been tremendous for so many people, because it has saved many lives. And so I can't be a full Luddite in that sense. I don't want to go all the way back to like before antibiotics. But just because you believe that this one kind of technology has been incredibly beneficial doesn't mean that thus you should be uncritical about the adoption and use of all forms of technology. And that's a very binary way of thinking. It's an all or nothing way of thinking that we should just learn to get past. And the conversations we're going to have about technology and what it means to live a good life in relation to those technologies is going to require that we get past those ways of thinking.
I love the positive spin on the Luddite. It makes me feel a little less embarrassed, because you're right. There's such a negative, such a pejorative term, like, oh, the Luddites, they weren't able to adapt with the times. But sometimes you need the negative people to, if nobody is bringing up these issues. And you're totally right. Like, I'm very concerned about AI stealing my cognition and social media stealing my attention, but I would love to see a cure to Alzheimer's and cancer. So you're right that it's not an all or nothing rejection of technology.
Yeah, I have a family member with Parkinson's right now. And right now there are ways to kind of make it less bad, but there's no way to cure Parkinson's as far as I know. And I see that and think, I would love, and if one day someone told me an AI discovered the cure for Parkinson's, I'd be like, amazing, right? I haven't seen it yet, but like, if it would be amazing, because you can see how that disease just ravages your body. Or as we are able to, cure other chronic illnesses or these other degenerative diseases. Alzheimer's, of course, is like one of the most tragic to think about. So I would love to see that. Yeah, of course. And I think people who say all technology is bad, I actually don't meet a lot of people who actually say that, but the ones who say it maybe in their more unthinking moments, they need to be reminded. But given the kind of current technological landscape we live in, where it seems like every hot startup in Silicon Valley is just like a new AI product to try to sell you, to get you into another $10 a month subscription for a thing that maybe you don't really need. And that is, I'm convinced, just stealing all of your data all the time anyways. If that's where kind of fresh talent is going, that doesn't bode well for the technological future either.
I think I want to end with something that's a little more positive and very practical. One of the videos that you published that I really appreciated was how to start reading again. And it's a 20-minute tutorial on how to start reading books again. I used to devour books when I was a kid, and they were not high literature. It was all Star Wars novels. But I would sit down and I would read one of those Star Wars novels in like 3 days, just devour it. And sometime, ironically, in college, and I think this was with the rise of social media, I stopped reading cover to cover books. And even now, when I'm doing research for videos, it's like targeted chapters. And okay, I'll read the chapter in this scholar's work and then the article over here. But to sit down and procedurally, page 1 to page 300, vanishingly rare. And you advocate start reading again.
Well, the first thing I would say is if you want to start reading again, just find some books that you think are fun. Because maybe if you want to start reading books cover to cover again, the answer isn't like make yourself read those scholarly books cover to cover. I mean, that's the dirty secret of academia anyways, right? Most people are doing targeted reading for their research. I like to balance what I read quite a bit. So I'm reading like classic literature or like new literary fiction. I try to read a decent amount of philosophy every year, but that's always slower going. But the last book that I read was a Terry Pratchett novel, like a Discworld novel, because I love Terry Pratchett and he's funny and they're easy to read. And are they like super edifying to me or like, are they helping me in my intellectual growth? No, not necessarily, but I really love them. And I think if you're someone who's not reading at all, one of the big problems is that you might immediately start thinking about what books should I read? Well, asking you about like the optimal books for you to read or like the books that like the best books that have ever been written, you're not even there yet in solving the problem. The problem is just like get yourself reading again. So I just recommend like fun books to get you started. Find things that kind of already interest you. So then you can just start reading again. The other thing that I recommend for everybody is to carry books with you. If you have an e-reader, it's even more convenient, but just find a book you can carry with you. Because, you're standing in line at the post office and you've got 10 minutes. What are you going to do? You're going to pick out your phone and start scrolling. Almost everyone's going to do it. And because you're bored and you want to not be bored. And I understand that impulse. But if you carried a book with you, just start reading the book. People kind of look at you a little funny when you do it, like in the line at the post office, but like, who cares, right? They're all scrolling on their phones. Just read the book. Because if you can read for those 10 minutes, and then maybe you're reading a little bit at night and a little bit in the morning, well, you pick up those 10 minutes throughout the day as well, you're doubling what you read very quickly. And I think with those two basic points, right, is like read things that are fun, at least at first, to kind of build up those reading muscles and those attention muscles again, and then to get yourself in the habit of just reading where you go. You'll start reading a lot more, and eventually those books that you feel like you should read, you're going to read Dostoevsky, you're going to read Dickens, you're going to read Dante. Great. You are now kind of prepping yourself to be able to go and do that again. Because it's very hard to go from 0 to 60, right? If you're not reading at all, especially, you're only watching videos, ease yourself in a little bit, just read. Then ask yourself, what are those great books that I really want to read? And it gets easier over time.
Well, Jared, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Hey everyone, thanks for watching. Before we wrap up, just a quick thank you to everyone who supports Religion for Breakfast on Patreon. This channel takes a ton of work behind the scenes. Research, consulting experts, editing, and Patreon is the single best way to keep all of this going. My goal for 2026 is to get 1,000 patrons supporting this channel, and we saw a huge response in January, surging from 700 to 800 patrons, which is just amazing to see. Thank you to everyone. So if you want to support our work publishing evidence-based videos on religion so we can boost everyone's religious literacy, support us at patreon.com/religionforbreakfast. Thanks, everyone.